My husband humiliated me during our anniversary party to announce his engagement, so I revealed. The ballroom of the Rosemont Hotel sparkled under golden chandeliers, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and people dressed in their finest. Sabrina stood near the floral centerpiece, a subtle smile on her face as guests approached to congratulate her on 10 years of marriage. To most people, it looked like a celebration of love and success, a wealthy couple surrounded by influential figures in the industry. But behind her smile, Sabrina felt a cold sense of detachment. Something in Damien's behavior over the past few weeks had shifted. He was colder, always on his phone, and recently had begun shutting down conversations whenever she brought up their future. She chalked it up to work stress, but deep down, a tremor of fear had started to grow. As Damien stepped onto the small stage beside the pianist, adjusting his suit with practiced confidence, a hush fell over the room. Sabrina took a sip of her champagne, watching him as he gave a brief nod to the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, flashing the charming smile that once captivated her. 10 years ago, Sabrina and I made a promise to build a life filled with ambition, love, and purpose. He glanced briefly at her, his eyes empty. "And tonight, I want to share something new. A turning point." Sabrina's grip tightened around the stem of her glass. She expected a romantic surprise or a heartfelt gesture. But instead, she saw Bianca, a familiar face from Damien's company, stand from her seat near the front. In a red silk dress, she walked toward the stage, her movements slow and theatrical. Sabrina's heart dropped. The moment Bianca took the microphone from Damien, time seemed to pause. Guests looked at one another in confusion, unsure if this was part of the evening's plan or an impromptu moment. "Sabrina," Bianca said with a too bright smile, "you've been a part of Damien's life for a long time, and I respect that. But I think it's time everyone hears the truth." Her voice carried over the sound system like a blade, sharp and cold. "Damien and I are engaged. And we're getting married this fall." A ripple of gasps tore through the room. A fork clattered onto a plate. Someone near the bar whispered, "Did she just say engaged?" Sabrina didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stared at Damien, who now stood awkwardly beside Bianca, avoiding eye contact, his mouth twitching as if struggling to hold its shape. Bianca continued, holding up a diamond ring that shimmered under the lights. "He deserves someone who understands him. Someone who shares his vision. And I'm lucky to be that person." Her words landed like poison, meant to sting and impress. Sabrina looked around. Dozens of eyes were on her, waiting for a meltdown, a slap, tears, screams. But instead, she gently set down her glass on the table and nodded, lips barely curved into a smile. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She stood tall in her navy blue dress, chin slightly lifted. The silence she offered in return was louder than anything she could have said. And that silence made Damien visibly uncomfortable. His hand reached for his collar. Bianca's smile faltered for a second. They had expected a scene. But Sabrina wasn't playing their game. After the announcement, the air in the room changed. People whispered in corners, unsure whether to leave or pretend nothing had happened. Damien tried to carry on with the evening, talking to a few guests with forced laughter, but everyone could feel the awkward tension coiling around the table. Sabrina moved with quiet grace, acknowledging those who came to speak to her with polite nods, saying little. A guest, a longtime partner of Damien's, approached her and said softly, "I'm so sorry." That was unexpected. She only responded with, "Was it?" Her voice was calm, almost detached. Damien noticed her from across the room and quickly turned away. He wasn't prepared for how composed she was. And that frightened him more than if she had thrown wine in his face. Bianca hovered near him all night, radiant in red, soaking up attention, clearly proud of her public victory. But as the evening dragged on, she began to notice something unsettling. Guests weren't fawning over her. In fact, Many of them looked uncomfortable. Damien's closest allies offered tight smiles and exited early. One woman who had served on the board of directors shook her head before leaving, whispering something about bad timing and lack of class. Damien finally realized that the announcement, meant to humiliate Sabrina, might have backfired. Yet, Sabrina said nothing. No accusations. No confrontation. Just silence and that unsettling, poised smile that wouldn't fade from her lips. It was the same smile she gave him the night they signed their prenup. The same one she wore when she took the call after her grandfather's funeral. A smile Damien had never really understood. 45 minutes later, most of the guests had left. Damien and Bianca had slipped into a prearranged black car, avoiding the press and the discomfort of lingering eyes. But Sabrina didn't go home. Instead, she requested her driver take her to the Arloft building in the business district. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as she sat in silence, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The driver opened the door at the side entrance of the tower, a private elevator already waiting. She stepped inside and pressed the button for the 46th floor, unlisted, unmarked. The doors opened with a soft chime into a sleek, minimalist office. No signage. No logo. Just quiet power. There, Thomas was already waiting. "Shall we proceed with Protocol Avalon?" he asked, handing her a leather folder. Sabrina nodded. Yes. Tonight's announcement gave us the leverage we needed. She walked across the room, past a wall of frosted glass, into her private office. Behind her desk hung a single abstract painting. She tapped a code into the panel beneath it. The painting slid aside, revealing a safe. From it, she pulled out 3 original ownership certificates, one for each of the controlling funds behind her husband's company. All of them bore her name. She placed them on the table with quiet reverence, then looked out the window over the city. "They think I'm humiliated," she said. "Let them think that. For now." That night, Sabrina worked until dawn. With Thomas's help, she reviewed internal memos, tracked financial transfers linked to Bianca, and finalized the new presentation for the company's board meeting. Damien's original plan was to announce a corporate restructuring that would eliminate the last of the original shareholders, people loyal to Sabrina's late grandfather, who founded the parent firm decades ago. But now, that script would change. The new version bore her name on the front slide, Interim CEO Sabrina Whitmore Blake. She didn't need to steal power. She already had it. The only thing left to do was reveal it. She closed her laptop, exhaled deeply, and turned off the lights. The city outside was waking up, but for Damien, a different kind of morning was coming. Meanwhile, Damien awoke in Bianca's apartment, checking his phone nervously. He hadn't heard from several key partners who were supposed to meet him later that day. Bianca, still glowing from her big moment, hummed to herself as she made coffee. "I still can't believe it. Did you see her face? She didn't even blink. Probably still in shock." Damien didn't respond. He was already unsettled. Something about Sabrina's calmness the night before, it wasn't normal. It wasn't defeat. It was something else. Something colder. More deliberate. As he scrolled through emails, he noticed a message from his assistant, urgent, restructuring plan locked. Access denied. The subject line hit him like a punch. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. But the answer, he'd soon learn, was far worse than anything he imagined. Sabrina stood before the large, tinted mirror in her private office, buttoning the cuffs of her tailored navy blouse. Her hair was pinned neatly, her expression composed, almost serene. The reflection staring back was not of a scorned wife or a victim. It was of a strategist. The kind who moved pieces long before the opponent knew a game had begun. As she adjusted her collar, Thomas entered quietly, holding a slim black folder. "The revised shareholder packet has been sent," he said. "The transition language is in place, and legal reviewed it. All that's left is the presentation at the boardroom. Sabrina gave a nod of approval and glanced at her watch. It was 6:42 a.m. In less than 2 hours, everything would begin. While most people woke to alarm clocks or morning coffee, Damien was waking to chaos. His attempts to log into the internal company portal were denied 3 times. Confused and increasingly anxious, he called his IT director, who sounded groggy and hesitant. "Mr. Blake, I don't understand. Your credentials were revoked at 4:15 this morning by CEO authority." Damien's heart skipped. "I am the CEO," he barked. The director stuttered, "Sir, the documents show that's no longer the case." The system updated itself through the registered administrator profile. Damien hung up, his hand trembling. Bianca walked into the room with 2 mugs and paused. "Damien? You look like you saw a ghost." He didn't answer. Because suddenly, he realized he might have. Back on the 46th floor, the office that Damien had always assumed was for archival use buzzed quietly with life. Thomas and Sabrina reviewed the slide deck one final time. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m., but the board had already begun arriving. One by one, the elevators brought up the senior members, men and women who had, for years, thought Sabrina was just the elegant wife behind the company's success. Few had questioned her presence at events or the silent way she observed financial discussions. They never noticed she was listening more closely than anyone else. And now, they were about to realize that she had been the one writing the final checks and signing the real contracts all along. Sabrina took her place at the head of the polished walnut table, her expression unreadable. Each board member opened a black folder labeled with the company's emblem and the phrase Operational Transition Plan. The first page bore her name, clear and firm, Interim CEO Sabrina Whitmore Blake. Murmurs spread across the room. One of the older members, Mr. Geller, frowned and adjusted his glasses. "Is this some sort of misprint?" Sabrina folded her hands neatly on the table. "No, Mr. Geller. It's not." She clicked a remote, and the screen behind her lit up with her first slide. Today marks not only a shift in leadership, but a course correction in vision. Eyes widened. Mouths fell slightly open. And in that moment, Sabrina spoke with the calm of someone who had waited a decade for this precise move. As the meeting progressed, Sabrina's voice remained steady, each word slicing through layers of assumptions and deception. She unveiled the corporate structure piece by piece, how a private investment group named Amara Holdings funded the initial expansion, how each voting share within Amara was held under a series of trusts, and how the controlling trust bore her birth name, Sabrina Whitmore. One board member leaned forward, whispering, "Whitmore, as in Charles Whitmore?" Sabrina turned to him. "My grandfather." The room shifted uncomfortably. For years, Charles Whitmore's influence had been a footnote in Damien's rise. Now it was the headline. A lineage that had gone unacknowledged publicly, by design, now stood at the heart of the company. She explained how the original founding contracts designated a clause known only as Clause Epsilon, a succession protocol triggered only by violation of trust, moral breach, or attempted coup. She tapped a key on her tablet and displayed images of Bianca and Damien, along with timestamps and internal emails linked to shady acquisitions, backroom deals, and a plan to dissolve the original board. "He violated every term," she said, her voice low. But more than that, he mistook proximity for power. A heavy silence settled over the room. The board, once his allies, now saw the truth. Damien had never been the architect. He had been the frontman. And the woman he'd tried to discard? She'd always held the blueprints. Meanwhile, Damien stormed into the main lobby of his company's headquarters, demanding access to the 20th floor executive suite. But even the receptionist looked unsure, already having received the memo with the new access hierarchy. His keycard flashed red. Security hovered nearby, hesitant. Damien shouted into his phone, trying to reach legal, HR, anyone. But every line either went to voicemail or redirected him to Sabrina's assistant. It was as if the entire infrastructure had shifted overnight. And in a way, it had. Ghost shares, ownership units that carried weight only under specified legal triggers, had been activated. Invisible until yesterday, they had now become the most powerful shares in the entire company. Back upstairs, Sabrina continued the presentation. For 10 years, I allowed him to operate under the illusion of control. I didn't do it out of fear. I did it for the legacy. My grandfather warned me that men like Damien would seek influence through charm and ambition. But influence without character is like a tower with no foundation. She paused, letting the room sit with the words. So I waited. And now, the foundation has returned. Several board members nodded. Others glanced at each other with new understanding. The shift was happening not with fanfare or fury, but with precision. Damien thought she'd lost. But in truth, she was just getting started. Sabrina stood before the final slide, Phase 1, Termination of Fraudulent Acquisitions. She clicked her remote and brought up charts showing manipulated valuations linked to Bianca's department. The numbers were undeniable. Her team had inflated projections, masked deficits, and routed funds into shell vendors with no registered business licenses. These acquisitions were part of a larger exit strategy, she explained. A strategy designed to crash the company while allowing 2 individuals to walk away with golden parachutes. One member cleared his throat. Are you suggesting criminal intent? Sabrina didn't blink. I'm confirming it. She reached into her folder and produced 2 sealed envelopes, placing them on the table. These are copies of the full forensic audit and emails compiled over the last 6 months. A separate report has already been sent to our legal team and the Financial Ethics Bureau. A slow ripple of realization spread through the room. This wasn't just a leadership shift. It was a purge. A reckoning. Sabrina took a breath and looked around. The plan was called Echo because every betrayal leaves an echo. And those echoes, eventually, returned to the source. The board was silent. Not out of fear, but out of something deeper, awe. The woman they had once overlooked was no longer waiting in the shadows. She was now leading from the front, with silence as her weapon and truth as her armor. While Sabrina finalized the post-meeting memo with Thomas, her mind was already shifting to the next stage. Damien's restructuring plan, originally designed to cut loyal senior staff under the guise of modernization, was now under her control. She opened the presentation file he had prepared weeks ago. It was laced with euphemisms, terms like leaner productivity, and post-traditional reallocation. In reality, it was a quiet massacre of people who had served the company since its inception. Sabrina's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Then she began rewriting, page by page, term by term. Names of those Damien had planned to discard were now replaced by his inner circle, including Bianca's recently hired managers. The updated version bore a different tone. Where Damien had planned to eliminate legacy staff, Sabrina announced their reinstatement and promoted several mid-level employees who had been sidelined. She inserted new benchmarks and a timeline for ethical review of all acquisitions under Damien's tenure. The speaker name on the first slide? Sabrina Whitmore Blake, interim CEO. Her heart beat steadily, not out of adrenaline, but clarity. She wasn't just retaliating. She was restoring balance. By the time she pressed send to shareholders, the weight of years she had carried in silence began to lift. Damien had humiliated her in public. Now, she had rewritten the future in private, and soon, the world would see the difference. As Sabrina returned to her private suite in the office tower that evening, Thomas met her at the door with a small, encrypted tablet. "It's time," he said quietly. Inside the device was the culmination of months of surveillance, whistleblower reports, and confidential emails, compiled discreetly by an internal ethics investigator Sabrina had hired long before Bianca entered the picture. The file was named Obsidian. It outlined a trail of fraud so wide it touched federal transport contracts, falsified marketing analytics, and covert transfers routed through shell firms in the Cayman Islands. Most damning were 6 audio clips, recordings of Bianca, on separate calls, referring to upcoming project failures as golden breaks. Sabrina sat on the edge of her desk and pressed play. Bianca's voice oozed through the speakers, casual and calculating. "He'll never know. Damien's obsessed with the title, not the structure. Once it collapses, we cash out and go private. He thinks he's building an empire, but he's just finishing the blueprint we started." The sound of laughter followed. Sabrina paused the clip, her face expressionless. "She was never after Damien," she murmured. "He was just the vessel." She copied the files to a secure drive and wrote a short message to the company's legal department. Subject line: immediate compliance review. No exclamation points. No threats. Just the truth, delivered like a scalpel. In the early hours of the next morning, Sabrina found herself in her grandfather's study, a space preserved just as he left it when he passed. The walls were lined with ledgers, handwritten notes, and faded architectural blueprints from a time when corporations were still built by handshakes and trust. On the oak desk, nestled between a fountain pen and a cracked leather journal, was a framed photo of Charles Whitmore holding a toddler, her in a white dress. He had been more than a businessman. He had been a visionary. And he knew the world didn't treat women, especially young heirs, as equals. That's why he taught her not to seek visibility, but control. She sat quietly, flipping through an old folder labeled Echo Plans. Inside were sketches of organizational pyramids, annotated with names she now recognized, people who had unknowingly played their roles across decades. A post-it note, yellowed with time, bore a handwritten message: "If they ever try to erase your voice, don't raise it. Just redirect the room." Sabrina read it twice before smiling faintly. It was never about outshouting Damien. It was about building something stronger behind his noise. She turned off the lamp, leaving the room untouched. There was nothing left to mourn. Her grandfather had passed the torch. And now, she would carry it publicly, for the first time. As the news began to spread of Damien's removal and Sabrina's rise, internal employees flooded the HR inbox with mixed reactions, some grateful, some stunned, others unsure what to believe. But in the marketing division, Bianca was still clinging to control. She walked into the open office floor with bold steps, demanding her team ignore any illegal memos. She declared Sabrina's authority null and ordered the next campaign launch to proceed. A junior analyst, visibly shaken, replied nervously, "But the access portal changed. We're locked out unless she authorizes us." Bianca's face twisted in disbelief. "This is a stunt," she hissed. "She's bluffing. Damien will fix this." But no one moved. In their silence, Bianca heard what she had feared the most: it wasn't a bluff. Meanwhile, Damien sat in a small downtown law firm, unshaven and dazed, staring at a thick envelope marked emergency severance terms. His lawyer, once cheerful and accommodating, now spoke in clipped tones. "They have the documents, Damien. Ownership, the financial audit, the forensic trace, everything. You don't have leverage. At best, we negotiate your exit. At worst, well, that depends on the prosecutors." Damien opened the envelope, skimming the terms. His severance was conditional on silence and cooperation. He laughed bitterly. "She planned this. For years." The lawyer nodded. "She waited until you handed her every tool. You just never saw her hands." For the first time, Damien understood, he wasn't just outmaneuvered. He was irrelevant. Sabrina returned to the 46th floor that afternoon, standing by the window as a light drizzle touched the city skyline. Below her, the streets pulsed with indifferent rhythm, unaware of the war that had quietly unfolded in glass towers above them. Thomas stood beside her, handing over a final printed list: terminated contracts, flagged departments, revised executive hierarchy. "It's complete," he said. "Phase 2 begins Monday." Sabrina nodded, but didn't speak. She was thinking of every event she had attended over the last decade, standing beside Damien like decoration, his eloquent wife, his tasteful partner. She had smiled through condescension, through side glances, through empty compliments. But now, she saw that same city with different eyes. Not as a spectator, but as a steward. The silence she had maintained wasn't weakness. It was discipline. A tool she used while others underestimated her. She turned to Thomas. "No more shadows," she said simply. "Let's make it official." That evening, an email was sent to every department. Subject line, Leadership Transition. Attached was a message from Sabrina, composed with calm authority. No vengeance. No gloating. Just the truth. And at the bottom, her full signature, Sabrina Whitmore Blake, Chief Executive Officer. For the first time, her name stood alone, without apology, without disguise, and without needing anyone to introduce her. By 7:30 a.m. on Monday, Sabrina stood in the executive lobby, a fresh cup of black coffee in her hand and her ID badge, now marked CO, clipped to her blazer. She stepped into the elevator, alone. The mirrored walls reflected calmness, but inside, her thoughts were as calculated as a chess game. On the 20th floor, chaos had already begun to bloom. Damien's former allies were being locked out of key systems. HR had received instructions for new compliance protocols. Legal was conducting interviews. The wave of change wasn't subtle, it was designed to be impossible to ignore. Across the city, Damien sat outside the Westlake office, furiously tapping at his laptop. Every login attempt failed. The access codes, company VPN, executive emails, everything had been disabled. He called Bianca, but she didn't answer. In fact, she hadn't since Sunday afternoon. Panic crept in as he refreshed his inbox again, only to find a single message from Sabrina. "Please contact legal for severance negotiations. Further access is prohibited by board resolution." For a moment, he sat still, stunned not just by the precision of her execution, but by how little noise she made doing it. Inside the newly restored executive boardroom, Sabrina walked past portraits of previous CEOs, most of them men, most of them chosen for their boldness, not their wisdom. She didn't stop to admire the history. Instead, she stood at the head of the table, where Damien once sat, and called the meeting to order. On her agenda, accountability reviews, organizational restructuring, and the formal vote to confirm her permanent CEO role. She didn't have to convince them. The documents had already spoken louder than any speech. The board voted unanimously. Her position was secured, not through inheritance or scandal, but through competence. As she signed the final confirmation form, Mr. Geller, one of the most senior members, leaned forward. "I misjudged you," he said. "We all did." Sabrina gave a gentle nod. "That was my intention." She glanced at the digital screen behind her, where live dashboards now ran with clean data, no ghost accounts, no fake subsidiaries. The rot had been cleared. "This company was built on legacy," she continued. "But legacy means nothing if we allow it to be hijacked by ego." The room fell silent again, not out of tension, but respect. For the first time, they weren't seeing the woman behind the man. They were seeing the woman who had built the man's entire platform. Across town, Bianca finally answered the knock at her apartment door, only to be handed a federal notice. A subpoena. Her face, once flawless with confidence, now paled as she skimmed the pages. The Department of Transportation had opened a full-scale investigation into procurement fraud. Her signature appeared in over 40 flagged documents, many of which were now part of the evidence Sabrina had forwarded. She slammed the door shut and collapsed onto the floor, whispering Damien's name under her breath. But he had vanished from her life, too busy saving himself to save her. Meanwhile, Sabrina's internal audit team had published their preliminary findings. Bianca's department had rerouted funds through fake vendors tied to her cousin's firm. That firm no longer existed, at least legally. More damning, however, were the email logs. In one message, Bianca had written, "Sabrina's a ghost in this company. She's married to the throne but doesn't even know where the crown sits." The irony didn't go unnoticed when Sabrina read it aloud during an internal compliance session. The employees listening didn't laugh. They simply nodded, as if realizing the truth they had missed all along. The ghost was never lost. She was waiting for the right time to become visible. By midweek, the media had caught wind of the corporate shakeup. Headlines began appearing: CEO ousted in internal coup, behind the takeover, the woman who waited, from wife to executive, Sabrina Whitmore's silent rise. Damien watched from a friend's apartment, his phone lighting up with questions, interview requests, and legal warnings. The narrative had shifted completely. He was no longer the polished executive with a perfect marriage. He was the disgraced husband whose career had been built on a scaffolding Sabrina constructed, and just as easily removed. He tried calling in favors, but most former contacts didn't answer. Those who did offered little sympathy. "You underestimated her," one said. "That's not just foolish. It's fatal." His name had been removed from internal company listings. His office had been emptied and repurposed into a quiet lounge for employee wellness. Even his company ID no longer worked. The speed of it all left him breathless. For years, he believed Sabrina was quiet because she lacked ambition. He never realized her silence was the sound of power accumulating, like water behind a dam. At exactly 3 p.m. that Thursday, Thomas walked into Sabrina's office holding a leather case. "The freeze orders have been processed," he announced. "All personal and business accounts linked to Damien and Bianca have been restricted pending the investigation. Offshore assets are under watch." Sabrina took the file, flipping through the confirmations. The financial world was no longer Damien's playground. Without access to liquidity or protection, he was exposed, legally, publicly, and financially. She didn't smile. There was no pleasure in ruin. Only closure. She looked out the window, the city below glowing in the amber light of late afternoon. Her office was quiet, peaceful. And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. She hadn't simply reclaimed a company. She had dismantled an illusion. An illusion that many women lived under, the belief that being quiet was weakness, that love meant sacrificing your vision, that humiliation meant the end. But Sabrina hadn't been destroyed. She had been sharpened. Now, with the company back under rightful stewardship, she turned back to her desk. There was more work to do. Not revenge. Restoration. By Friday morning, Sabrina's story had gone viral. A well-known finance blog published an exposé titled "The Wife Who Owned It All," and within hours, major news outlets picked it up. Social media erupted with debates, admiration, and speculation. Sabrina's face, once relegated to the background of press events, now graced headlines with words like power, poise, and precision. But while Sabrina remained composed behind her desk, Damien and Bianca were watching their digital lives unravel in real time. Every photo, every public appearance, every quote was being dissected and reframed through the lens of betrayal and arrogance. Bianca's Instagram, once filled with designer outfits and luxury vacations, became a war zone. Comments poured in by the thousands. "So this is the homewrecker CEO? Stealing husbands and stealing funds, huh?" Brands that once sponsored her dropped partnerships. A week ago, she was being considered for a business award in innovation. Now, her face was removed from the event brochure. Her silence only added fuel. When she finally posted a statement claiming she was just following Damien's lead, the backlash doubled. Her attempt at innocence was crushed beneath the weight of receipts, and Sabrina had all of them. Damien, once the golden boy of the financial world, could no longer walk into a restaurant without whispers. Former colleagues avoided him. His name was unofficially blacklisted in several industry groups. Without access to his funds, he struggled to maintain even the facade of control. He paced in his temporary apartment, replaying old emails and searching for missed warning signs. In one moment, he screamed at the wall, smashing a glass. In the next, he sat in silence, face buried in his hands, whispering to himself that it wasn't supposed to end like this. He tried reaching out to Sabrina once. Just one message, "I'm sorry. Can we talk?" He never received a reply. And that silence, colder than any threat, broke something in him. He thought he knew her. Thought she was soft, passive. Thought she needed him. Now he realized she had been orchestrating something far greater. He had mocked her discretion, never noticing the quiet strategy beneath. And now, as the empire he claimed was stripped from him, he saw her for what she truly was, not his wife, not his reflection, but his reckoning. While Sabrina reviewed the final round of asset reports, a message arrived from someone unexpected, Alina Monroe, a former senior compliance officer who had been dismissed under Bianca's supervision a year prior. "I was let go for questioning a supplier deal. I have something you'll want to see." Intrigued, Sabrina arranged a meeting. Alina arrived at a quiet rooftop cafe, bringing with her a file thick with printed email threads, timestamps, and vendor inconsistencies. She had kept everything, anticipating she might one day be vindicated. Her eyes lit with a mix of anger and hope as she laid it all out. Sabrina listened closely, reading between lines, tracing the corruption that stretched even deeper than she anticipated. Bianca hadn't worked alone. A junior executive, Nolan Firth, had been laundering payments through a fake consulting firm. Alina had warned Damien once. He dismissed her with a warning of disruptive behavior. Sabrina thanked her. "You did the right thing," she said. Alina looked away for a moment. It didn't feel like it at the time. But now, Alina had not only found justice, she had found a place in Sabrina's vision. That same afternoon, Sabrina reinstated her into the company, appointing her head of ethics and compliance. The next week, Sabrina stood before a crowd of employees, media representatives, and industry leaders at the company's annual conference, now rebranded under her direction. It was her first public appearance as CEO. The auditorium buzzed with anticipation. Cameras rolled. When she stepped onto the stage, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, the room quieted instantly. She looked into the crowd, not with nerves, but with authority that came from surviving betrayal and building something stronger on the other side. "I was never supposed to be standing here," she began. "For years, I was told I should be satisfied standing beside someone else's spotlight. That I should smile, stay quiet, support quietly." She paused, her voice steady. "But silence is not surrender. And support should never mean sacrifice." The room erupted in applause. She continued, speaking of legacy, resilience, and integrity. Her words weren't polished, they were real. And by the time she stepped off the stage, the applause had turned into a standing ovation. Not because she had taken back what was hers, but because she reminded everyone watching that dignity, when paired with purpose, is unstoppable. Later that evening, in the quiet of her study, Sabrina opened an old chest her grandfather had left for her. Inside, tucked among photographs and notes, were a series of handwritten letters addressed to her. Some were practical, business advice, contingency plans, but one stood out. It was dated just months before his passing. "If you're reading this," it began, "then the storm has passed. And I know you weathered it in your own way." His words carried warmth and foresight, a belief in her long before she believed in herself. "You'll be tested not just by the world," he wrote, "but by your own heart. Don't let anyone convince you that grace isn't strength." She sat for a long time, reading and rereading the letter. For all her control and composure, this message was the first thing that brought tears to her eyes. It reminded her that her journey wasn't just about corporate redemption. It was about honoring the person who had raised her to be more than a shadow in someone else's life. She folded the letter gently, placing it back into the chest. The world outside buzzed with news, drama, and speculation. But in that quiet moment, Sabrina smiled, softly, not as a CEO, not as a woman scorned, but as a granddaughter who knew she had finally made him proud. Bianca sat alone in the waiting area of a downtown law firm, her phone buzzing relentlessly. She no longer answered. Headlines now bore her name, not as a rising executive, but as a suspect. The subpoena had escalated. Her passport had been flagged, and a formal indictment was imminent. When her attorney entered, his face was drawn and tense. "They have a solid case," he said. "Wire fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. You need to consider a deal." She blinked, frozen. All the power she had flaunted, her curated image, her expensive wardrobe, her confidence, meant nothing now. Every ally had vanished. Later that week, Bianca was escorted out of her condo under a sealed warrant. Cameras clicked, news anchors narrated, and Sabrina watched it all from her office, not with satisfaction, but with solemn resolve. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Bianca had tried to climb her way to power on the back of someone else's destruction. Now, justice had answered. Sabrina didn't speak publicly on the matter. She didn't need to. The truth had already done the talking. And the company, once shadowed by secrets, was finally breathing clean air again. Damien finally reached out again, this time with a handwritten letter delivered by courier. Sabrina unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the neat cursive. It began with apologies, long paragraphs about blindness, arrogance, and regret. "I thought I was building something," he wrote. "But I was standing on something you built for me. I see that now." He begged not for forgiveness, but for understanding. "I should have seen your strength. I thought silence meant absence. I was wrong." At the end, a simple line, "I hope, someday, you'll remember who we once were." Sabrina read it twice, her face unreadable. She didn't feel anger. Not anymore. She folded the letter and placed it in her drawer, unanswered. She wouldn't destroy it. But she wouldn't respond either. Damien's words came too late. And while he sought closure, she had already found it. Some doors don't close with slams. They close with silence, peace, and finality. And this one had quietly shut long before he realized it was even swinging open. With the company secure and the old guard gone, Sabrina turned her focus toward rebuilding. Not just structurally, but culturally. She formed a leadership development program, prioritizing underrepresented voices and elevating talent that had once been overlooked. The atmosphere began to shift. Employees who had worked in fear now spoke with confidence. Ideas flourished. Productivity soared, not through pressure, but through inspiration. The organization was transforming, and people knew it. The difference wasn't in profits. It was in the heartbeat of the company itself. One afternoon, Sabrina walked through the open-floor offices, stopping to speak with interns, analysts, even janitorial staff. Her presence wasn't performative. It was natural. She had once been ignored in these halls. Now she led them. Thomas walked beside her, smiling. "It's strange," he said, "how much changes when people feel seen." She paused, watching the light pour in through tall windows. "It's not strange," she replied. "It's exactly what was always missing." She wasn't just leading. She was healing. One decision at a time. Months later, Sabrina was invited to receive the Vanguard Business Leadership Award. The event was elegant, filled with industry giants, media representatives, and rising entrepreneurs. As she walked onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't her designer dress or title that earned their admiration. It was her journey, quiet strength, unshakable grace, and the wisdom to act when others doubted her most. She stood at the podium, accepting the award with composure, then leaned into the microphone. I once believed that protecting a legacy meant staying behind the curtain. But legacy isn't quiet. It speaks through actions, through courage, through knowing when to step forward. She paused, her voice steady. I've learned that the most expensive mistake a man can make is underestimating a woman who chooses silence over spectacle. Because when she finally speaks, she doesn't ask for permission. The crowd rose in applause. Sabrina smiled, not for the praise, but for the clarity. Her voice was no longer hidden. And it would never be silenced again. Later that night, Sabrina returned to her townhouse, the award resting quietly on the hallway table. She poured a glass of wine and stepped onto her balcony, the city glowing beneath her. The noise of the world faded, replaced by stillness. Alone, she thought not of victory, but of the road. The hurt, the humiliation, the betrayal, it had all carved her into someone stronger, not harder. There was a difference. She hadn't lost her kindness. She had just learned where not to place it. That lesson had cost her more than time. But it had given her everything that mattered. She leaned against the railing, recalling the moment Damien made his cruel announcement months ago. She remembered the silence in the room, the weight of all eyes on her, and the fire she'd held back with a single smile. That moment didn't break her. It forged her. And now, with the city at her feet and the sky stretching above her, Sabrina whispered words meant only for herself. Sometimes, the worst day of your life is the one that sets you free. And in that freedom, she found not revenge, but peace.